welcome so much to Thank Science. I'm Nathan Cohn with Texas Public Radio, and at each of these talks, our goal is to bring you in and out in just about an hour, having learned a little bit more about the subject at hand. And our focus today is on forensic discoveries. San Antonio is a treasure trove of history, and forensic scientists and archaeologists are instrumental in bringing that oftentimes forgotten history to light once again. And just this year, the remains of one of the first Black churches in San Antonio were discovered while city workers were excavating and constructing along the new San Pedro Creek project. We'll learn more about the role forensics plays in historic discoveries today. But also, what about that kind of CSI angle? How can forensics aid law enforcement in solving crimes, such as estimating the time of death? Or how does disease affect the body after death? Can forensics play a role in determining cause of death from undiagnosed conditions? In short, how does the study of the long gone affect the here and now? Our panelists today include Daniel Westcott, Director of the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State University, Matthew Elberson, RPA, City of San Antonio archaeologist, and Dr. Sean Marceau, City of San Antonio archaeologist. When it comes time for the Q&A portion of the panel today, if you would, you'll see on the GoToWebinar screen a little hand icon in the dialog box on the right side of your screen. If you push that hand button, it'll allow you to kind of raise your hand and then type a question in the question box by clicking the question mark. So I'll be able to relay that information to the panelists as a question if you could. So we're going to start with Daniel Westcott, and I'm going to make him a presenter in just a moment here. He is a biological anthropologist with a research focus on developing and testing anthropological methods for reconstructing biological profiles, trauma patterns, and the post-mortem interval. He is also a dedicated teacher and mentor with experience directing undergraduate and graduate students at Texas State University. And let's see here, as I click on him, I'm going to see if I can get his profile up here, and there we go. There we go, Daniel Westcott, and okay, Danny, you should have the presenter function right now.
Okay, can you see that?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, so my slides are up?
Yes, role of forensic anthropology.
All right, yeah, so thank you very much. So yes, I'm the director of the Forensic Anthropology Center. So that's what I was going to talk to you a little bit about, was just some of the roles of the forensic anthropologist, and then a little bit about our center, and then some of the research that we're doing right now, specifically on drone research. So, you know, the forensic anthropologists utilize methods and theory in anthropology, and particularly related to the recovery analysis of human remains to help resolve legal matters. So we will help assist law enforcement. We will also assist attorneys, both defense and prosecuting attorneys. So it just kind of depends on what we're doing. Some of the roles of the forensic anthropologist include the search and recovery of human remains, establishing the forensic context. So there, what we're talking about is it, if you find a skeleton, is it human or not human? And then even if it is human, is it of recent times, it's something that law enforcement would be interested in pursuing. The development of the biological profile. This is a way to kind of narrow down who we're looking for. So we're estimating the age of the individual, the sex of the individual, how tall they were, information like that. Trying to interpret any kind of trauma or postmortem damage. So the trauma, what we're looking at is there past trauma that might help in the identification of the individual? Is there recent trauma that might be associated with the individual cause of death or manner of death? or is there postmortem damage that might tell us something about how the body was handled after death. We also help with the estimation of the time since death. So how long has that individual been dead? And we usually refer to this as the postmortem interval. And then, of course, we write this into a legal report, and in some cases have to testify in this in court. And we also then do research and training. So the Forensic Anthropology Center, its purpose is to provide education. We do this for our students and also for law enforcement agents, medical legal investigators, individuals of that nature. We also do research, and then we also provide service and outreach. So the service is we actually do casework for law enforcement and others. So our mission is really just to advance forensic anthropology through world-class education, research, service, and outreach. We have a really diverse faculty, and we have one of the largest faculty of forensic anthropologists. So we have 7 forensic anthropologists that are on the Faculty of Facts. We are also one of just a handful of places in the country, or actually in the world, that have a human decomposition facility. So there, as you can see on this, there are several around the country. Actually, since we are in Texas, so we have to be better than everybody else, we have 2 in Texas. And then there's also a new one that's being developed in Canada. But so we're one of the unique places. We also have the largest one as far as acreage goes. So we have a 26-acre facility where most of the facilities are relatively small. So our facility is located out on Freeman Ranch. So we, like I said, we have a 26-acre facility that we utilize. This is kind of what it would look like. So we use place the bodies out there, and typically those bodies will be placed in a cage to help protect them from scavengers, but in some cases they may not be. And so we rely on our donation program. So we have a willed body donation program where individuals donate their bodies specifically to us. And as you can see here, on the bottom axis is the year, and then on the y-axis is the number of individuals. So in 2008 is when the facility started. There was 3 donations, and that has steadily climbed to where we now typically reach about between 70 and 80 donations a year. There are a lot of reasons that people that donate their bodies to us donate. This is information from actually a thesis that was done here at Texas State. And one of the #1 reasons was an interest in the scientific process, a desire to be helpful after death, and a desire for an alternative tradition to a traditional funeral. So this was common among all of our donors. And among the people that donated themselves specifically was also a cost savings. And then for next to kin donations, where the person didn't sign up with us before they died, it was typically a desire to honor their wishes, where they had donated or they wanted to donate but just didn't get around to filling out the paperwork prior to death. Let's just give you an idea of where some of the donors come from. Most of our donors are from Texas. The ones in red are the ones that are the states that we have gotten received donors from. Most of them come from Texas, but we get them from across the country. And so I'm just going back. One of the things that we had talked about, was that one of the roles of the forensic anthropology is to help in the search and recovery of the remains. And so this involves typically something like a pedestrian search, where we go out and look for clandestine remains in an area that we think is highly likely, but this means covering typically very large areas. The other part of this is that once we find something, it also involves the mapping of the process, mapping where the skeletal remains are found, and basically doing our forensic archaeology here. So what we've been doing is doing some research looking at drones. So drones have some big advantages. One is that we can fly them over relatively rugged terrain, over large areas. We can even predetermine where they're going to fly. And we can use these to find potential locations for clandestine remains. The other thing about them is that they actually will help us with the mapping as well, because we can come down low with them. We can shoot video of as we fly around, and actually then use that in photogrammetry to reconstruct a 3D map of the site. So the way that we do this is use different types of drones, but we also, what's probably more important, is that we're using different types of sensors. And so the sensors can be infrared, near infrared, regular video, or regular cameras, or we can use hyperspectral or multispectral cameras as well. So it just depends on what we're doing. So this is just to give you an idea of our facility as you fly over it with a near infrared camera. And as the body decomposes, it will actually heat up. And so we can see the body, but also the ground below it will also heat up. And so you can see the differences here. The red would be an indication of much warmer or much hotter objects. We can also, this is just another image showing infrared. And what's interesting about this one is that the two kind of bright spots on the right-hand side are where two bodies used to be, but they're no longer there. And this is during the middle of the day. And then on the left-hand side is two bodies that have been placed out there, but that are almost skeletonized. And you could still pick them up a little bit. So some of the research we've been doing is looking at the time of day. Does that make a difference? The season, the state of decomposition, does any of that make a difference? And so this is just showing you an example of a infrared camera on the top, and then the just normal camera on the bottom of looking at an individual. This is the same individual, and it's at the same time of day. The only difference here is that it's sunny in the one on the right and cloudy on the one on the left. And so as you can see, it's a lot easier to see the individual on the right. Another thing that happens with this is that we get a lot of organically rich soil that forms as the bodies decompose, and we can utilize that as well to help locate bodies. And so we can use what's called near infrared. And near infrared, the organically rich soils will come out as kind of white looking, as dark looking, and then vegetation, especially healthy vegetation, will come out as kind of white looking. And so, for example, down here, we can see an individual, and we can see the decomposition island really bright here. In this one, we can see the decomposition island surrounded by a ring of really high, lush vegetation. And this is because it's an older burial, or older surface remains, where the nitrogen in the soil has been broken down by the bacteria and is working to make that vegetation healthier. So it's just showing you some of the differences here. We can also use this for burials. So this is just an example. So you can see right here are different burials. And basically what we're picking up is that where you might not be able to pick this up if you were just walking around, is that we're actually picking up slight differences in the vegetation. The vegetation over the burials is just a little bit greener, and so it reflects back just a little bit differently. And then, of course, we can also use this for mapping purposes. So I know we're going to do questions later, so I will stop there.
Dr. Westcott, can I ask a quick follow-up question right away?
Sure, of course.
So I was really interested in what you said just a moment ago when you were talking about how the organically rich soil that can be spotted from aerial above it. I guess something like that could be used to help find missing persons. Is that correct? Like some one of the ways that that could be utilized?
Uh, yeah, that's the whole point of it is to find missing but deceased individuals.
Right.
Uh,
Yes.
right. Yeah, that's the whole point of this is to use different methods during different times to see to be able to locate individuals and locate graves of individuals.
What do you think is the most significant discovery that's in research that's come from this facility?
Oh God, it just depends on what you're interested in. So there's all kinds of stuff that because we have researchers literally from all over the world that come as well. So we have people that are studying the insects. We have we're studying the drones. We have people that are studying the uh, how bodies move after death and what causes that. We have research that's been done on the microbiology. We have research that's been done on how cadaver dogs locate bodies and smell bodies and what kind of factors affect those. We have research that's done on, um, you know, fire death investigations. So there's just lots of different research. And so I don't think I could say that there's like one specific thing that has really come out of this.
One woman in our audience today, Miss Martin, asks a question, says that she's donated her body to the forensic department of Texas State and was going to get a tour of the facility. Then the coronavirus struck, but she wants to know what you can tell her about how her body is going to help and how her family can get her body to the facility during this time.
Okay, so we actually, so if she is registered, then if her family contacts us upon her death, then we will actually pick up within a 100-mile radius, as long as the individual's not at a private home. We can't pick up at a private home, but we can pick up at a hospital, funeral home, um, any kind of hospice centers, things like that. And then as far as what happens to the body, so we have multiple processes that typically go on. So part of it depends on what happens to the body immediately depends on the protocol of the research that the body's being placed in. So how it gets placed is already kind of predetermined. But typically what happens is the body will go out to our outdoor decomposition facility, and there it will be studied as the body decomposes, and this will typically last from 6 months to several years. And then when the body is ready to be removed, we will typically use it for training as well. So we will bring out students or law enforcement and teach them how to recover the remains, how to map in the remains, and get the information that they would need. It gives them exposure to doing this kind of work without having the pressure of being a real case. And then we also will, after that's done, then the skeletal remains will go back to a lab where they are processed down and cleaned up. And this is done by students as well. It allows them to learn their osteology really well. And then the skeletons come to a third lab where they are curated, and we utilize them for all kinds of research associated with the skeletal remains. So those could be on developing new methods for identifying, like the biological profile. It could be on methods or just learning about human variation. So for example, we have a large study right now where we're looking at how obesity affects the microstructure of the bone. So there's all kinds of things that get used, and this just continues over and over and over again. So unlike a medical school where you donate your body and you are used for one class dissection. Here at our facility, the body gets used over and over and over again.
We're going to get to some more of questions for you, and just a little bit as we move to the open portion of the discussion later on this hour, and just a little bit on timing, folks, since we did start about 7 or 8 minutes after noon. Again, thanks for your patience on the technical difficulties. We will go about 10 minutes past 1 o'clock so that we can ensure that we get as much material in as possible today. So thanks all for your patience. And there were a lot of questions in there about what happens if I pass away now during the coronavirus times, and if we can all wish now that coronavirus passes before we do, for all the donors. A little bit of gallows humor there for us, but thank you all for everybody who's signing up to be a part of this donation project. That's really noble and honorable. We appreciate that. But I'd like to move on now to Matthew Elverson, and a slightly different tack on forensics that we're going to talk about during this hour as well. Matthew Elverson is one of 2 archaeologists with the city of San Antonio. We'll be hearing from him as well as his colleague Sean Marceau in just a few minutes from now. Elverson's degrees are in history from Guilford College and anthropology from Texas State University. He studied, then he got a master's in anthropology at the University of Memphis and has his PhD in anthropology from UT Austin. And I am going to mute Daniel Westcott, and then Matthew, I'm going to move over here and make you a presenter. And you should have control now. And unmute.
Thank you, Nathan. Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. Can everybody else see it? If you want, just type in the chat window.
Okay, I think we're good.
Right.
Thank you for having me. Again, yes, my name is Matthew Elverson. I'm a city archaeologist with the city of San Antonio, and I'm going to be taking a little different take on forensic discovery, specifically the relationship of forensic techniques and forensic anthropology to archaeology. So before I jump into some interesting examples of that relationship, I'm going to talk about the project review nexus and how archaeologists may get involved with the exhumation or excavation of human remains through project development. So we review projects through federal law, National Historic Preservation Act. In Texas, we have the Texas Antiquities Code, which requires coordination with the Texas Historical Commission for new development on public property. And then on the local level, in the city of San Antonio, we review and coordinate archaeology under our Unified Development Code. So a good example of a federal project that was recently completed in San Antonio was the Mission Reach project that was federalized because of the coordination with the Army Corps and potential impacts to the San Antonio River. Good example of a state project subject to the Texas Antiquities Code was the recent rehabilitation of the Plaza de Armas building down next to City Hall. Through this rehabilitation of the building, excavations in the basement were required to install sump pumps. And through those excavations, we actually found intact in situ, so in their original context, features related to the 1722 Presidio San Antonio de Bejar. And so when you look at in an aerial view of the plaza around City Hall today, that was actually the footprint of the 1722 Presidio. And you can see some artifacts here on the right from those excavations. And then another state law that's probably most applicable to this conversation is the Texas Health and Safety Code, which essentially protects burials both on public property and on private property from development, from improvements. And in this photo, this was actually an excavation, I believe, from the 1970s in San Antonio, the discovery of a Native American cemetery. This is a drawing of one of those burials, and from an archaeological standpoint, this drawing, this information gives us, this excavation, provides a lot of helpful information, because the darker items drawn here in this illustration are actually grave goods deposited with the burial, so we can understand cultural practices, trade routes, and it's very helpful. And then on the local level, the Unified Development Code, we review projects that not only go through our Historic Design Review Commission, but also we review plats, master development plans, and planned unit developments across the city limits and in our extraterritorial jurisdiction. In this photo, you can actually see 19th century building foundations that were discovered for development downtown. And then on the far right, top right, excuse me, you can see a late 19th century rehabilitation of the San Pedro or Principal Acequia, just south of downtown. And then in its original construction method, the same acequia in the lower right photo, but as an earthen construction, so it was not stone lined. So a good example that I was lucky to experience of forensics and in archaeology was before I started with the city of San Antonio. Was actually at Texas State, was an excavation at St. George's Key. And St. George's Key was the original capital of Belize. It's a little island just off the coast of Belize City, and was occupied by reportedly private pirates and later British citizens and Belizeans, and is the battle location for the Battle of St. George's Cay against the Spanish. So in this field school, we actually were excavating and exhuming burials from that colonial age cemetery on the island. And before they actually initiated excavations, they conducted a ground penetrating radar survey to help refine where some of those burials might have been located. And you can see in this heat map, the results from that survey. What ground penetrating radar does was it kind of it functions like a submarine. It shoots radio waves down, different materials bounce back up and provide that information after they're analyzed. And so you could see, for example, the square area in the middle, likely representing a large tomb, and then quite a bit going on the right. And so that's why this large excavation operation was placed over these sensitive locations. So you can see that T excavation kind of in the middle of this screen. Several burials were identified, documented. You can see the hexagonal coffins, and actually a burial without a coffin, which is likely representing an earlier burial within the cemetery. And just a few photos of some additional excavations on the left and the right. What was really interesting about this investigation was that because the island was so small, a lot of these burials were actually under the water table. And so we had excellent preservation of organic material. You can see the coffin wood was very well preserved, and even some soft tissue of the burials were preserved. On the right, you can actually see cloth that is very well preserved, and all of this was below the water table. And a really interesting example on the local level in San Antonio was the discovery and excavation of a burial off of Blue Wing Road. Was discovered in 1968 during some grading activities for the street. You can see a drawing of the burial on the right. This burial was excavated by Anne Fox, who was then in 1968 with the Whitty Museum. And when it was first excavated in the field, the only artifacts that were observed at that time were some copper buttons that likely represented, breeches that were worn by the individual when they were interred. The burial was placed in a high clay environment, which made it difficult to remove the bone from the soil, and so because of that, they had to remove the burial in the soil in large sections. They were brought back to the lab, and they were actually water screened, but the water was poured over the clay and bone to separate the clay. Through that process, a large lead ball was found under the mandible in the individual's neck, and that ball is too large of a caliber to have been fired from a musket, and it would have been likely fired as grape shot or canister shot from a battle. What's really interesting about that, go back to my other slide, you can see here that this location is generally kind of in between the Battle of Rosillo, which took place in 1813, and then the Battle of Medina in 1813. We actually just passed that anniversary. Neither of these battles have been archaeologically verified. So after this discovery, this was very exciting in the archaeological and historian communities, because this could help verify that one of those battle locations. At the same time, we knew from the archival record, specifically from Jose Antonio Navarro, that Jose Antonio Menchaca, that a Colonel Miguel Menchaca was killed in the Battle of Medina after he was shot in the neck. And so with that in mind, the Center for Archaeological Research at UTSA conducted a biological profile estimation. Dr. Westcott talked about this a little bit, but to provide some more information about this potential connection to Colonel Menchaca, they pursued this biological profile estimation to identify the individuals, or help identify the individual's age, ancestry, stature, so height, review and analyze the dentition and pathology. Through this, they identified the individual as male, likely between the ages of 22 and 29 years of age, and also revealed prior fractures in the right ulna and right radius that had healed by the time this individual died. And those fractures were specifically identified as a perifracture of the right ulna, which is usually attributed to raising your arm to blunt or to stop a blunt injury, and then a Coul's fracture of the right radius, which is often the result of breaking a fall and extending your arm. So these injuries actually suggest episodes of violence in the individual's history, and further suggest that this person was a soldier. After this analysis, since the individual was identified as being between the ages of 22 and 29, it was confirmed that this wasn't Colonel Menchaca, because he would have been at the 42 at the time of his death. So as evidence in this one really interesting example, forensic science and forensic anthropology is very important in an archaeologist's toolkit when trying to solve these very complex archaeological riddles. And we always use use that option, use that subdiscipline of anthropology when we encounter these resources in San Antonio, when we encounter burials in San Antonio, to protect and preserve our rich archaeological history. And so with that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Marceau.
Sounds good. All right, let me unmute Dr. Marceau and make him a presenter. Dr. Marceau, I think you pushed your mute button yourself, so I think you'll need to unmute it because it's not letting me do it. There you go.
Can you hear me? Great.
Yes. Go ahead.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here. I was going to talk to you all briefly today about a site here in San Antonio and a project that took place. I think a quick admission, I'm not a forensic archaeologist, but that said, I have 20 years of experience in professional archaeology, including work for federal agencies, university research centers, private sector, and now as the city archaeologist for City of San Antonio. So I've been a part of a number of projects across Texas, primarily Central, South, and East Texas, Southeastern US, California, Eastern, Western Europe, and South America. And in fact, my earliest exposure to forensics as applied by archaeologists was abroad in Ukraine and Peru at sites. These were large-scale, multidisciplinary, multi-year projects that included the excavation of human remains. And so have a great deal of experience sort of incorporating forensic discoveries into archaeological investigations. So that's what I'm going to talk about today at the local level. Let's see if I can get my slide. There we go. So just wanted to talk about the Winters-Jackson Cemetery. This presentation will focus really on two aspects of the investigation and discovery. One is sort of the background research that goes into a project like this. And secondly, the archaeological investigation that was conducted to determine whether remains were still present. So this is on the northeast side of town, just off 1604 and Nacogdoches. The local project was done proactively with cooperation from the landowner. In other words, there was no regulatory trigger or city, state, federal project nexus that required archaeological work. So I led the archaeological investigation, but the person who was truly leading the project was Mr. Everett Fly, who is seen here. He's a landscape architect and a representative for the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. And his work on historic sites has been widely recognized, both here in San Antonio and elsewhere. And so Mr. Fly had done some extensive background research about the property and the people who were buried in the cemetery. His efforts included research in the archives, looking at historic documents, deed records, maps, other documentation, as well as contacting descendants of those buried in the cemetery. So his research really allowed us to a great starting point and helped us immensely in terms of determining the approximate area of the cemetery. You can see his survey on the right-hand side of the screen there, and then he's also indicating he's also pointing to one of the cedar posts that mark the corner of the cemetery. So he also, during his research, he found the death certificate for Amos Jackson, who was a former Buffalo soldier, which for those who may be not aware of what that is, it's a member of an Army Cavalry Regiment. These were African-American troops who protected the Western frontier after the Civil War. And Mr. Jackson was actually one of the first formerly enslaved people to buy land in this area. And Jackson's marker was one of the largest in the cemetery prior, and I'll get to some of the circumstances surrounding its current state. But according to one of his living descendants, it was, his grave was marked and it was sort of unmistakable as a gravestone. But with the landowner's permission, Mr. Fly had gotten out there documented some things, and then I was at the University of Texas at San Antonio Center for Archaeological Research at the time, and he asked us to come on and help do an archaeological investigation. Just a little bit more of information that was gleaned from the archival research. What we have on the in the presentation now was a scan of a cattle brand certified by the state of Texas in 1874. And this was Antonio Anthony's brand. He donated, he was one of the folks who donated land for part of this former cemetery, and one of the 3 African-American families to use it. So the Winters Jackson Cemetery was a private cemetery. It was in use from at least 1876 to 1937. And those dates are according to Gravestone, which is a nearby cemetery, and that's what we were looking at in this slide here. So during Mr. Fly's research, he discovered that the graves had been removed at some point in the mid-80s. Apparently, landowner was looking to develop the property, and without the permission of courts, there are certain legal processes that you have to go through in order to move a cemetery. Those weren't, there were no, as far as we could tell, legal documents to make sure that to basically make it happen. But they were moved. There are records that indicated that 72 individuals were relocated. But during Mr. Fly's research and in talking to, again, these are some of the descendants you're seeing on the screen now, they made it clear that there were over 100 individuals buried there. So this suggested to us and Mr. Fly that there were additional persons likely buried there. So it's approximately, the cemetery is approximately an acre within a 70-acre tract of land. And really the only markers on the surface were a cedar post that I showed you him pointing to earlier, and a cut stone marker. And the cedar posts and a barbed wire fence matched the description provided by one of the descendants who was interviewed by Mr. Fly. So again, corroborating the location and area around this cemetery. So again, when the UTSA Center for Archaeological Research was called on, our goals of the we basically had 3 goals of the investigation. One was to determine whether there was any remnant of the cemetery that had been left behind on the surface, determine whether any human remains or graves had been left in back dirt piles that were left on the site after relocation. So essentially, when they excavated and relocated the burials, there were big dirt, about approximately 8 piles, back dirt piles, that were left behind. So one of the goals of the archaeological investigation was to go through those back dirt piles and determine whether there were any remains in those piles. And then lastly, we wanted to determine whether any graves lay outside of the cemetery boundaries. So the boundaries of historic cemeteries are sort of notoriously unreliable. Essentially, they can be, sometimes they were filled up, and so they continue to bury outside of what were the originally established boundaries. Sometimes minorities, paupers, other folks were buried just outside the official boundaries of a cemetery. So we wanted to be sure that if this area was ever developed in the future, that we had delineated the cemetery completely. So, and through the course of that investigation, we took those, this is some field photos of the investigation where we dug into the back dirt piles, screened them for artifacts. Let's see, next slide, here is the trenching that we did. So the image on the left is a map. The sort of beige lines are the backhoe trenches. These trenches were excavated just sort of wide enough to try to determine whether any grave shafts were present. So you're looking for disturbances in the soil. These are the same sort of things that you see and would see in some of the other presentations through remote sensing or some of the other methods that Dr. Westcott mentioned as well. And so we basically just essentially cleared these areas to ensure that there were no burials there. So during our investigations, we found several bone fragments that were identified as human. So indicating that there was a continuing presence of human remains at the sites. We also found some diagnostic mortuary hardware. So that's what's on the screen now. You'll see some thumb screws. These are used in these are essentially coffin hardware on the top left and top right. Fasteners, thumb screws, some handles, and then we also found some personal items, buttons, and a copper buckle. So again, all indicating that there was in fact remains left at the site. And it's sort of interesting, we also found that there was some prehistoric material on the site. So stone tools, debitage, some burned rocks. So there was apparently a prehistoric occupation at the site as well. But these the artifacts you see on the screen, they all match up temporally, so they're diagnostic to the time period when the cemetery was active. So that again, providing further evidence that this was that cemetery. And so I guess just sort of in summary, I just thought this was a great example of a project in San Antonio, especially in light of current events, the recognition, the sort of greater recognition now of systemic racism and with the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a project that essentially went out there and demonstrated that, here is an area that was, nearly forgotten. Here was a cemetery that was nearly forgotten. There's been sort of a rediscovery and better recognition of the importance of these types of cemeteries they're often either understudied or not studied at all, and sort of forgotten when we do our research of San Antonio. So just think it's an important reminder that these are the types of things that are out there and still need to be discovered and studied. And that's about all I have. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sean. We appreciate it. Let's see here. I'm going to come back over here and pull up my screen as well. So if you have any questions, by the way, again, as I said earlier, all you need to do is either put them in the chat room window, which is on the right side of the screen, and I'll add a sample chat in here right now, or you can also raise your hand and ask a question, and I'll pull from there. I'm going to unmute all three of y'all, Sean, Matthew, and Daniel, and ask, I guess, a follow-up from earlier this afternoon for Dr. Westcott, but also something that might be of note for our other gentlemen as well. Amelia asks, when we were looking at the aerial views of, where again, you were determining remains being in a place, are you able to differentiate between the remains of a human versus an animal at that higher level of the aerial view?
Actually, it depends on what you're seeing. So a lot of cases, no, you're not. The idea is to cover an area to try to find some hot spots that you will then investigate later or thoroughly. But the nice thing about a drone is that once you find something like that, you can actually drop down and get live feed video, and in that case, you would be able to tell whether it's human or non-human.
Okay. Dr. Westcott, Laura asks, are you ever called upon to testify in court cases? And if so, how often?
I am. It's not frequent. Maybe a couple times a year at the most. But I do get called upon depending on what is going on. Usually, when we get called upon to testify in court, it's usually either associated with a time since death or some kind of trauma on the skeleton.
And then one more question for you. Do you wrap all the bodies in different materials to see how they decompose and look from the air, or is that how that affects them?
It does. And so it depends on the protocol of the study that that specific body is being used in. Sometimes they're being wrapped, sometimes they're not being wrapped, sometimes they're placed in a specific type of clothing, something of that nature. For our study, we are doing them mainly where they're either buried or on the surface, and we are actually collecting temperature data and stuff like that. And we've tried to put them in different positions as well as in different locations, like for example, like under a tree, you know, to where or in a shaded area versus a sunny area where it's a little more difficult. And what we're trying to do is actually develop algorithms that will actually look at this video feed that you get and can actually search it and come back. And part of those algorithms are literally just going, here, I found something that looks like a person. And so what we're interested in is, you know, if you put them in a fetal position on their side, can that algorithm still identify it as a person versus them laying just flat out?
A question comes through. It says, does your work ever intersect what's going on in South Texas with immigrants, migrants passing over the border who have died in ranches and elsewhere in remote locations in the state?
Yeah, so Dr. Spradley, one of our faculty members, has a program called Operation Identification that's within FACTS. And so this, the whole purpose of this is to locate the remains of migrants and try to identify the individuals so they can be repatriated to their families.
Matthew and Sean, could you talk a little bit about here at Texas Public Radio, we're in a building that is right on San Pedro Creek, and we're quite literally next door to some of the more interesting discoveries that have happened this year, in fact, with the church that was the remains of which were found within feet of here, it seems. Can you do you all have any insight into the project that's going on there and what that's going to mean for development and also recognition of that place and that time, and what have people found there?
This is Matt Elverson. So that project is actually under federal, state, and local purview for archaeology, and so it's being coordinated with our office, the Texas Historical Commission under the Texas Antiquities Code, and an archaeologist with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, because it's also under the National Historic Preservation Act. So because it's a federalized project, the development, the potential impacts from construction are evaluated for their adverse effects or impacts to resources, both archaeological and above ground. So before construction started, if you're familiar with some of those stone walls that lined San Pedro Creek, those are also evaluated under the same law. But just like you mentioned, the church foundation was discovered through this project, through the construction process, and is still in coordination with those agencies and all the stakeholders involved. It's also potentially the site of the original Menger Soapworks. As you know, the second location for the soapworks is just up the creek and is still standing. But this is potentially the first location. And after it was occupied by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it was then utilized as an ice house and brewery. So all of those components, some of which are visible currently, may either are visible or may still reside under the soil of that location.
There's a question coming through from Vivian, and many of you on the panel have experience with Texas State, and she asks, at Texas State as a student, are you able to, in a way, get your feet wet with real-life cases or begin practicing your profession in a way as a student when you're at Texas State?
For me, yes. So what we do is typically what we will have students that will, undergraduate students that will volunteer, and they start out usually volunteering, doing processing or inventory of the remains. They can go out, they'll later on go out and help collect the remains. They also can get involved in research projects to some extent. So I've had undergraduates that have specifically worked on their own projects, and then I have, for example, this semester I have an undergraduate student that is working on an intern who is actually working on that drone project with me.
Any other questions from the question and answer room right over here? I'm going to look and see something. Oh, somebody asks Dr. Westcott, how can they update their information? She's a donor already, and she says she recently had COVID. How can she update her information in your system?
For right now, what she'd have to do is just send us an email at fax@txstate.edu and include whatever information she wants updated, and we could do that.
Great. Last call for questions before we close things out. We're a few minutes over 1 o'clock, and we've gotten a lot of really interesting information this hour about not only what happens at Texas State and San Marcos, but also right here in our city of San Antonio. I was especially enjoyed learning about that cemetery, Sean Marceau, on the northeast side of town. I had read about that some in the newspaper, and that was just fascinating. So thank you for sharing all those slides with us today. Well, I want to thank all our panelists for being a part of this today. And thank you to Daniel Westcott, to Matthew Elverson, and to Sean Marceau. This presentation, for those who have asked in the question box, will be available on our website next week so that you can share it with a friend. We'll edit the top and bottom of it so that you don't have to have the just the generic slides at the beginning as we were getting things started at noon. Our next Think Science discussion will be virtual like this. It's going to happen in November. It'll be an online presentation about sanitation and cleanliness and how we ensure safety during the time of COVID. That's coming up in November. Look for details at tpr.org, and that's where this presentation will reside starting next week as well. So Dr. Westcott, Dr. Ellison, Dr. Marceau, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I certainly appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.